Amen. Hey, good morning, guys. It's good to be here. Good morning. Jim, thanks for praying for me. I appreciate that. But does anybody else think it's pretty special when Philomena prays? Yes. Wow, I felt really sorry for Arif having to pray after that. That was pretty special. My favourite moment of the morning so far, my little boy, Benji, he was next to me, and Dominique just said, "Hey, we're going to have baby dedications this morning." And Benji looked up at me and said, "What's a baby medication?" So maybe that's the thing we need to do next, baby medications. I'm really looking forward to speaking this morning. You might know that we're taking a bunch of time as a church to really study the book of John. We're taking time each week to unpack a new section of this amazing book of the Bible, to really dig in and hear from God through these words. And I was thinking a bit as we prepared about what Jesus' greatest hits are. You know, if someone was making a compilation which had all of Jesus' best miracles, I think you'd probably pick big hits like, turning water into wine, or feeding the 5,000, or raising Lazarus would probably be on there. I reckon the story that we're looking at today would be on there too. Side 1, track 2, Jesus walking on water. And I'm going to say something a little bit bonkers to you this morning. I don't even think that's the best bit of this story that we're going to look at. So should we dive straight in? Okay, if you've got a Bible, why don't you turn to the book of John, and we're going to be starting at verse 16. So John 6, verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus hadn't entered it with his disciples, but they'd gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. So, I want to tell you a secret about myself this morning. Now, I'm assuming that you probably look at me as somebody ruggedly capable, a man who can handle anything on land or sea. Would that be right? Thank you. Well, here's the secret. Guys, I am scared of boats. Now, I'm not scared of the concept of boats per se, I get that they're useful, I accept their existence, but I hate going on boats. I get freaked out even going on the Isle of Wight ferry. But I want to tell you a story, and I hate to blow my own trumpet, but I need to tell you this, and this is hard for me to talk about in public. But on honeymoon, Jen and I went whale watching off the coast of Boston. And, sorry, just need a minute. Like I said, guys, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but we went whale watching, and it was a bit choppy. We got out of the boat on this little catamaran thing, and I remember thinking to myself, you know what? I don't want to die, but if you give me death as an option to get off this boat, I would consider it. And to be fair, there was one point of the voyage where the back of the boat had so many sick people on it that it looked like the end of the Battle of Hastings. Now, poor Jen, my wife, she was feeling sick, but she was just about holding it together. And then we saw the whales, this beautiful mother feeding its nursing calf. And the tour guide said, "Whale milk has the same consistency as cottage cheese." And at that point, Jen wasn't holding it together anymore. Why am I telling you this story? Because there aren't many things that I would hate more than being in this story. I'd love to see Jesus walking on water, but being on a small boat in the dark in a storm is one of my absolute worst nightmares. Now, this is one of a few miracles that take place in the Bible that are recorded in 3 of the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and John. I don't know what Luke had against this particular miracle. I don't know, maybe you felt the same way that I do about boats. But it's in 3 of the 4 Gospels, which means we have 3 records of what happened. And it's really interesting how John draws out different things from this story, not to contradict the others, but to tell a different story. John has like a laser focus on showing us that Jesus is the divine Son of God. So he focuses on different things to Matthew and Mark. I bet that one of the things that most of us remember about this story is about Peter getting out of the boat and walking to Jesus on the water. It's really interesting that John doesn't even mention it, because John is all about pointing to Jesus as God. For a bit of context, in the last message from this series, Kieran was sharing about Jesus miraculously feeding 5,000 people. And that happens on the same day as this. It's the same day that Jesus has found out that his cousin has been killed as well. It's a pretty draining day. And the other Gospels tell us that Jesus withdraws on his own to pray. No wonder he needed time to himself. And the feeding of the 5,000 happens outside a town called Bethsaida, which is just to the northeast of the Sea of Galilee. And the disciples need to get across to the other side of the water to a town named Capernaum. And Jesus tells them to get into a boat and row across while he withdraws by himself to spend time with God. Now, the disciples don't have to travel a huge distance. It's about like 3 miles as the crow flies. So this shouldn't really have been a particularly stressful journey. At least 4 of the disciples were fishermen by trade, and they were used to these waters and to rowing long distances. It's not even a particularly big deal that they were doing this journey at night, because lots of their fishing would have been done at night as well, when fish couldn't spot their nets and the weather would be cooler. But we see something going wrong. The wind has got up, it's buffeting the boat, it's blowing against them. There's a phenomenon that happens especially on the Sea of Galilee. Even now, gusts of wind form rapidly. They push between cliffs and down onto the lake. And because the lake is 680 feet below sea level, the water gets quite warm quite often. And when the cold air coming down from the hills meets the warm air rising from the waters, it often causes like sudden and violent storms. I love things like this, when we see little details in the Bible that are authenticated by what still happens today. As we look through these verses, we're going to look at how we kind of get 4 miracles, or four wonders, if you like, for the price of one. Now, I said to you that Jesus feeding the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water would make it into his greatest hits compilation. It's bonkers to say this, but I don't think they're even the most amazing things that happened on this one day. So here's my first point that I want us to look at. Sometimes all of us are at sea. Sometimes we face storms. Amen! I feel like we need to acknowledge that sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes we face storms. Sometimes we face battles that we're not expecting. Sometimes things aren't the way that they should be. And that's true for everybody on earth. Those of us that follow Jesus don't get a free pass. And there's this dangerous and wrong way of thinking which says that if you're a Christian, God will protect you and everything will be easy. You'll be financially well off. You'll never get sick. You'll never get parking tickets. That kind of thing. Here's the truth. That is not what the Bible says. Jesus tells us that in this world we'll have trouble. I wish it wasn't true, but it is. And if Jesus was going to protect anybody from troubles, it would be the disciples, his guys. They're following him closely. They're walking with him every day. So surely he's going to make sure that they get an easy ride. But for the disciples, in the dark that night, they're facing trouble. The waves are rising, the wind's getting up, and they're in the middle of the water. The Old Testament is full of verses that remind us that the sea is a dangerous and frightening place that's full of forces outside our control. Right at the start of the Bible, in Genesis, we hear about darkness and chaos around the deep waters. Later on in the Bible, we read about Jonah being thrown into raging seas, and we hear David asking God desperately for help because he feels like waters have risen up to his neck. It's clear that the waters are to be respected, if not outright feared. When John wrote down this historical account, maybe he meant for his readers to see some of that symbolism as well. There's literal danger and there's metaphorical danger too in the circumstances that the disciples have found themselves in. The author Tim Keller says this. He says, the sea in general and the stormy sea in particular represents the fact that life is filled with terrifying, incomprehensible forces that can suddenly sweep you up. It can suddenly sweep you away or sink you. Now, the chances are, when you're on dry land, the dry land stays where you expect it to be, doesn't it? At sea, things change in an instant. Everything underneath you can move. And did you know this? Did you know that there are things in the sea that can bite you? Did you know that? Talk to Russ Dalton if you want to hear some stories about the things that he's seen underneath Brighton Pier. I don't want to go anywhere near it. Does life ever feel like that for you? Do you ever feel like you're at sea? Not the calm, nice day for a paddleboard kind of sea, but stormy seas with danger all around. Church, I wonder what turbulent waters you might be facing today. Maybe it's being out of work, or facing a diagnosis or a relational breakdown, or you're struggling with your mental health. Or maybe you're thinking about storms that are a bit more global. Maybe you're thinking about conflicts in Ukraine and Iran and Gaza, or humanitarian crises in Sudan and Syria, or maybe you're thinking about the storm of racial injustice or financial inequality. I think we can probably all agree that there are unsettled waters and there are storms. Sometimes all of us feel at sea. Right here in today's passage, the disciples are facing a literal storm. They're working hard, they're straining at the oars because the wind's against them. It's dark, they're tired, the waves are breaking over a pretty small boat. And that made me think about a question that storms sometimes bring up. Do storms mean that I'm outside God's will? It's so easy when we're facing turbulent waters to fall into this thinking, isn't it? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where things are going badly and you've started to think, I must be being disobedient. I must have somehow missed what God wants me to be doing. Things are going badly, so I must be doing the wrong thing. Well, this story disproves that. The parallel versions from Matthew and Mark both say that Jesus told the disciples to get into the boat. They're exactly where he wants them to be. He's told them to get into the boat. He's told them where to go. And odd though it sounds, he knew about the storm when he sent them. Do you feel today like you've got the wind against you? Does that mean you're heading in the wrong direction? Yeah, not necessarily. The disciples here are battling against raging wind, and they are exactly where Jesus has put them. There's a traditional view that a boat in the Bible is often there to represent the church. And as the church, we face storms as well, don't we? A world that's sometimes convinced that we believe the wrong thing. Consumerism, apathy, for the church in some nations, outright persecution. Whether we're talking about the disciples, us as individuals, or us together as the church, when we face stormy seas, what we need most of all is the presence of Jesus. I love what the author Bruce Milne says about this. He says, so Christ's presence brings renewed hope and power to his dispirited church, and where needed, to individual lives. The last word does not lie with the world. No matter how threatening its manifestations, Jesus still comes walking upon the waves. And in a recovered experience of his presence, the church, for all its internal failings, may yet sweep upon its way and at the last be carried by its triumphant Lord onto that eternal shore for which we're destined. Love it. What do the disciples in this story need more than anything? The presence of Jesus. What does the church needs now more than anything? The presence of Jesus. What do we each need more than anything? The presence of Jesus. So my next thing that I want to look at is how Jesus being present is what changes things. I promised that we'd look at 4 wonders in these verses. And here's the first one, that Jesus arrives on the scene. Yes! And it's important to look at how he arrives on the scene. Jesus comes to these tired and weary and scared sailors striding across the sea. And I want you to picture it for a moment, because sometimes we have a wrong idea of what this might have looked like. You know, the Sunday school version with Jesus tiptoeing across a glassy calm in a dressing gown. But it's not daylight, it's the middle of the night. It's not glassy calm, it's pitching waves. So the waters are crashing all around. And does John say that Jesus was slogging through the breakers? Does he say that he's battling against the waves? No, he says that Jesus is walking. And why is that important? because he is showing that Jesus is the master of gravity. He's the master over the forces of devastation and chaos. There's another occasion before this when Jesus and the disciples are at sea in a storm. You know, the waves have risen once again. The wind is howling. The sailors are convinced that they're going to drown. And Jesus, what's he doing? He's sleeping peacefully in the back of the boat. They have to wake him up. And what does he do? Yeah, if it was me, thankfully I don't have this power, but if it was me, I would wake up, I'd roll up my sleeves, I'd take a deep breath, and I would command the storm like this. I'd ham it up a bit. I'd create drama. I'd spread my arms wide, and I'd yell at the storm as if I'm fighting it. What does Jesus do? He calmly rebukes the weather. Mark says, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Jesus is showing that he's the complete master over weather, over gravity, over nature. There is nothing that he can't handle. Now, back in our story today, Jesus isn't in the boat with them at first. He comes walking across the waves. And the disciples are terrified. And I find this really interesting because I assumed that they're terrified because of the storm. But that's not actually what this passage says. It says that they saw Jesus approaching the boat and they were terrified of him. And on first glance, you know, it's a bit odd that they're terrified because this is Jesus, their master, their friend, their rabbi, who they know and they follow every day. But they also know their Old Testament. And they know verses like Job 9:8, which says, "He alone stretches out the heavens and walks on the waves of the sea." And like this from Psalm 77, "Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were unseen." Or this from Isaiah 43, "This is what the Lord says, he who makes a way through the sea." The disciples are frightened because they know that the power to walk on water only belongs to God, and they're seeing it at work in Jesus. John shows us that what Jesus is doing is something that only the Creator does. So that's the first wonder, Jesus walking on the water. And I really thought that the second wonder was going to be Jesus calming the storm, yes. And I'd even started to plan this message with a whole big point about how Jesus calms storms. But then I realized that John doesn't actually say that. When I was first thinking about this passage a few weeks ago, I felt led to pray for a friend, and as I was chatting to them, they were sharing about the storm that they're going through. And honestly, it felt like just wave after wave of disappointment and pain has hit them in the past few years. I don't mean little things. I don't mean they were struggling to find parking spaces. I mean soul-crushing, life-changing things. And this friend has walked faithfully with Jesus through it. They've prayed faithfully, and they've asked Jesus to calm the storms, but the storms have kept coming. And I found myself wanting to share some hope with them. And I started to think about whether I had something to share from this passage. And as I started to open my mouth, I realized just how it might feel to this person who's prayed faithfully for Jesus to calm storms in their life. You know, if I just said, "Chin up, Jesus can calm storms," that wouldn't have been helpful at all, would it? And it made me wonder about the hope in this passage. Is there hope for those of us that are praying for an end to a storm and it's not coming? You're praying for waves and wind to die down, but you're still waiting. And that's when I noticed that there's something different in this passage that's different to the way that the other Gospels tell the story. Matthew says, "And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down." Mark says it like this, "Then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down." But John says, "Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading." John doesn't actually say anything about Jesus calming the storm. Is this a discrepancy? Is this a mistake in how John's telling the story? I don't think so. I think this might be another way that John is focusing on something different in the story to tell us something new. Matthew and Mark tell us about Jesus calming the storm. John tells us how Jesus takes the disciples through the storm to the shore. So there's the second wonder. Jesus takes them through the storm. I think that's so important because Jesus doesn't, unfortunately, calm every storm of our lives, and he never promises to. Church, there will come a day when every wrong will be made right, when there's no more sickness, no more death, and Jesus himself will wipe every tear from our eyes. But that's not yet. What Jesus does promise and what he guarantees for us now and for us today is his presence. When I'm going through a stormy season and I'm praying for Jesus to calm it, it doesn't always make me feel a whole lot better to know that Jesus calmed a storm for somebody else. Sometimes when we're going through it, what we need to know is that Jesus is walking with us through it. Now think about Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I'll fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. David isn't rejoicing that God's found him a way around the darkest valley. He's celebrating that God walked through it with him. Now, I wrestle with this because I do not want to become somebody that doesn't pray for situations to change. I want God to stir my faith more, to pray for miracles, to pray for healings, to pray for relationships to be reconciled, and for salvation when it feels like doors are closed. I want to learn better to be somebody that holds these two things in tension. Sometimes Jesus calms the storm outside. Sometimes he calms the storm in us. Sometimes he takes us to the other side immediately, like for the disciples here. Sometimes it takes time. But church, he's always with us. Yeah, I'm deciding that I want to keep coming to Jesus in the middle of storms and asking him to calm them. But whether he does or he doesn't, I'm going to cling to the one who climbs into the boat with me. He's my anchor. Let's go take a little drink. I've got to tell you, last time I preached, I brought this metal bottle with me for some water, and I hadn't thought about the fact that I'd also been using that bottle to take milk to my workshop during the middle of the week. And I had this kind of inch of just manky milk in my water bottle, and I didn't understand that until I was standing up here in front of everybody. So that's why I've gone for a clear bottle this week. Okay, so that's the first two wonders. Here's wonder number 3, and I think, hey, this is bigger and better than the first two. And it's not what Jesus does, but what he says. He comes to the disciples striding across the waves, and they're frightened. Now, what does Jesus say to them? He says, "It is I." Now, you can probably read that a few different ways. "It's me, ta-da!" Or like a stage whisper, like, "It's I." To us, maybe this is weird phrasing, but we need to dig a little deeper. Should we learn some ancient Greek? Come on, you might have got balloons with Arif last week, but this week we're bringing the ancient Greek. Come on. Jesus says, "It is I," which in the original Greek is just 2 words. Ego eimi. Ego eimi, which means I am. And by itself, that doesn't really mean much. It's just a slightly odd turn of phrase. But the disciples would have recognized these words straight away because they are the name of God. They know their Old Testament, so they'll know Exodus 3, where Moses asked God how to speak to the people that he leads. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What's his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God says to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you're set to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you should call me from generation to generation." Jesus is giving the divine name as his name. He's not just identifying himself as Jesus, he's revealing himself as God. When God says, "I am," he's saying something incredible about who he is. He's not saying, "I was," because he has no beginning. He's not saying, "I will be," because he never changes. And if he will be, then he needs to change. When he says, "I am," he's identifying himself as the unchanging God. Nobody else can say, I am. He doesn't exist because of something. Everything exists because of him. For the disciples, they're seeing this man rejecting the force of gravity and walking across the waves, showing that he's Lord over nature. And now he's using the name that only God can name. No wonder they're scared. So, Jesus says, I am. He points to himself as the Holy One, the eternal God, and that's amazing. But here's wonder number 4, the best news. The best news for us is what he says next. He says, it is I am. Don't be afraid. Or Matthew and Mark say, take courage. First of all, church, isn't that just the best news? That Jesus, who knows everything, sees everything, who is the beginning and the end, tells us not to fear. And this is a radical difference to when we hear the words I am in the Old Testament. When God calls himself I am to Moses, he tells him, take off your sandals, this is holy ground. When Moses asks to see God's glory, God won't let him because he'd be killed. Jesus is revealing himself as God all through this day, in miraculously feeding hungry people, in striding on the waves, in using the name of the eternal God. He keeps revealing himself. Now, when God revealed himself in the Old Testament, it's often with instructions to stand back. There's an implication that sinful humans can't come close to his holiness. God is holy, but we're not, so don't come too close. When God gives the 10 Commandments, he has a line drawn around the mountain where he's going to appear that people aren't allowed to cross on pain of death. The tabernacle and the temple were planned by God to show separation between God and humans. Only one priest was allowed to enter the inner chamber, and only after purification rituals. All through the Old Testament, from the fall onwards, there's a barrier between humankind and God. But here, the I am says, don't be afraid. And then he climbs into the boat with them. The I am wants to climb into the boat with you. In the midst of whatever storms you're facing, he climbs into the boat of your circumstances. If you've never put your trust in Jesus before, maybe today's your day. Maybe this is the time to invite Jesus into the boat with you and give your life to him. If that's you, don't miss this opportunity. As Jesus reveals his godness by walking on the water and giving himself the name of God, it's amazing that he would tell them not to be afraid of him, not to fear him. Now, there's a right way to fear God, and it's 100% right that we should have a reverent, healthy, respectful fear of him. But Jesus is the only one that's able to tell us not to fear God. He's the one that walks ahead of us to bear the cross for our sin and shame and rises from the grave to conquer our death. Because of Jesus, the book of Hebrews can tell us to draw near to the throne of grace with confidence. Jesus is the reason that James can tell us, come near to God and he will come near to you. Come near to God without Jesus and his holiness will burn you up. Come near to God through Jesus and he won't just accept you, he'll choose to draw near to you. In this passage, we see Jesus revealing his power as he walks on the water. We see him revealing his divinity as he identifies himself as the eternal God. And here we see him revealing his gentleness as he climbs into a boat with tired and worried sailors and tells them, don't be afraid. If you feel at sea right now, there's hope. Jesus is the master over nature, over chaos, and over destruction. And that same Jesus promises that he'll walk through the storm with you. He draws close. He climbs into the boat with you. And that same Jesus who draws close is the one who has the name over every name and tells you, don't fear. So, as John tells us, the Creator God in human flesh, the one hidden in the burning bush, is climbing into the boat. And what happens? The boat immediately reaches the shore. It's interesting to me that John says the disciples were willing to take him into the boat, as if the one who rules the waves needs his permission. But as they take him into the boat, they reach the far side immediately. When we choose to let Jesus into the boat of our lives, there's an immediate change. And not necessarily in all of the circumstances, but in the destination and where you're going. There's a certainty, an ironclad certainty of our destination. What's our destination? Listen to these words from almost the very end of the Bible. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." That's our destination, church. A land with a king on his unshakable throne who will wipe every tear about every storm from our eyes. That's the shore that we're headed for. When Jesus is in the boat, the destination is certain. I heard a great story the other day. In 1952, a lady named Florence Chadwick tried to swim from Catalina Island to the coast of California. For 15 hours, she faced choppy waters, possible shark attacks, and extreme fatigue. Then a thick fog set in, and she gave up. She tried again a couple of months later. Once more, it was foggy. She faced the same conditions. She was just as fit as before, but this time she made it. And somebody asked her what was different from the first time, and she replied this. She said, "The first time, all I could see was the fog. The second time, I kept a mental image of that shoreline in my mind while I swam." Whether we're going to get there immediately or whether it's a long journey, our destination is certain. Because of Jesus, let's choose to keep our eyes on where we're headed. In a second, we're going to sing together. But I wonder if there's some people who feel like they might want to respond today. We're going to have a prayer team gathered over here who'd love to pray with you. Whether it's about one of these things or about something totally different. I wonder if there's people today who are feeling battered by the waves. Maybe you're carrying disappointment or pain, but I believe that Jesus wants to meet with you today and encourage you with his presence. Sometimes he changes the circumstances. Sometimes he changes us. If that's you, in a moment as we sing, why don't you come forward and pray with somebody? Jesus himself wants you to draw close to you as you draw close to him. Maybe you're feeling absolutely fine, but you just want to know more of Jesus' presence with you this week. Why not come forward and pray with somebody? Maybe you're realizing this morning that Jesus is revealing himself to you for the first time. Or maybe it's the 50th time, but you're recognizing it in a new way, and you need to welcome him into the boat with you. Is that you? Do you need to say this morning, "I surrender, Jesus. I'm letting you into the boat today"? If that's you, I'd love to invite you to come forward as well and pray with somebody. Don't miss this moment. Do you need to let Jesus into the boat of your circumstances with you? Don't miss it.